Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today with us in this very important conference. And we've enjoyed many contributions so far, both in terms of the presentations as well as the questions and some of the debate that have taken place. And if I might add, I've personally very much enjoyed the personal aspects of this conference, being able to associate with each of you. My name is Gary Doxey. I'm an associate director of the center here at Brigham Young University, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And I'm, together with my colleagues, we're very grateful that you would honor us with your presence. The session today is on religion and pluralism in a changing world. And our panelists include some very eminent people, and we're grateful for their presence today. Let me introduce Sophie van Bijsterveld, who is from the Netherlands, an old friend of ours. Although she's young, she happens to be an old friend. We've known each other for quite some time. She serves on the academic advisory board of our center, for which we're very grateful. And you can read each of the biographies of our panelists in detail. I won't go over the details, but I wanted to point out that personal side. Her help and support for our center is very much appreciated. She is in the upper house of Parliament of the Netherlands, and she is a professor of law and religion and one of the leading experts in Europe. We have Grace Davie, who is a professor emeritus of sociology from the United Kingdom. And we're grateful in a subject such as pluralism to have a sociologist with us. I think sometimes lawyers look at pluralism a little differently than sociologists, and we'll be grateful for that perspective. We have Victor Muniz Fraticelli from Puerto Rico originally, now a professor of law at McGill University in Canada. We're looking forward to his presentation. He's currently working on questions of autonomy of religious organizations, among other things. And finally, Fergus O'Bara, who is an advisor to the Vice President and Secretary General of the European Parliament. He's had a variety of activities through the years as one of the top staff members and advisors in European questions. He is from Ireland. He's listed on the program as being from the European Union. We're grateful for that because he's representing in a way the organization, but I need to tell you his nationality is Irish. And we're grateful to have him with us as well. He coordinates, among other things, the dialogue between the European Union and religious organizations. We'll go in the order they were introduced, and we will ask Professor van Bijsterveld to come forward now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your kind introduction. And I would also like to thank the International Center, and specifically Cole Durham and Brett Sharps, for the kind invitation to participate in this conference. It's great to be in Utah and in such an inspiring international environment. It is fairly new that we see in Western European countries a dynamic that connects religion to national identity again. And in my presentation, I will discuss the nature of this connection. And second, I will place this in a broader context of developments within the domain of the state and of the society. And third, I will look at how this trend more specifically impacts freedom of religion. My own view is that we should not simply dismiss this new trend, but that it is important to try to identify its significance and try to think through the challenges that it poses. And I speak in my presentation of Western European countries, but of course I have my own country, the Netherlands, more specifically in mind. And when I speak of Western European countries, it is important to realize that in these countries, and also in the Netherlands, there's a very long and also a strong tradition of religious pluralism. And although I will zoom in to some problematic sides of pluralism as it is conceived by some in our countries, it is still good to realize that the overall context is one of a solid acceptance of pluralism. Right, I will try if this works. In an article written a few years ago, the international relations scholar Mark Juergensmeyer, and his article was titled "The Global Rise of Religious Nationalism." In this article, Juergensmeyer discusses the tensions between religious and secular nationalism in the world today. And he sees these two frames of mind as rivals. They both, in his view, see the world in a coherent and manageable way. And they both, again in his world, provide a sort of meaning for the world on a day-to-day basis that goes beyond the things that we see. And according to Juergensmeyer, we witness these tensions between secular and religious nationalism in many parts of the world today, in the Arab world, but also in the Indian subcontinent, and he even mentions the United States. And he says that by accommodating religion in these secular nationalist systems, religion is also diffused in a certain way. But is this what we see in Western Europe, we can ask ourselves? And my answer to the question is no. We do see a lot of references to the Christian roots and Christian values, or Judeo-Christian roots and values. For instance, the former Prime Minister Cameron of the United Kingdom called England a Christian nation. We saw that the former Prime Minister Sarkozy also referred to the Christian roots of France and called for a stronger role of churches in the public domain. We see that our current Prime Minister, although he relegates religion to the private domain, still makes references to the Judeo-Christian roots of our country, and he also embraces Christian festive traditions. And even longer in Germany, we have this discussion about what the so-called leading culture, the Leitkultur, would be. And these are just a few examples of prime ministers or former prime ministers, but we see many of those examples at all sorts of political levels also now. So the references to Christianity and to the Christian roots are not so much from religious groups themselves, but they come from public officials. And they are not accompanied by a revival of religiosity, Christian religiosity in our countries. On the contrary, we see even an ongoing secularization. So, how should we see this? I think it is fair to say that these references to religion, and specifically to Christianity, can be seen as a reference to religion as a source of public morality, as a source of values, and as a source of identity. And our good friend Silvio and colleague Silvio Ferrari asked himself the question, can the concept of liberal democracy form enough of the glue that holds society together? And his answer was, perhaps not. And perhaps we should see that the state officials who make these references to religion implicitly use their own diversified church-state systems. Well, I seem to have some problems with...
Could we get the audiovisual people to see if they can help us?
So it seems that I was the cause of this myself. I just leaned against a cable, and that's caused the problems. but I will try again. So our colleague Silvio Ferrari says that perhaps these references to religion must be seen against the background of existing church-state arrangements in Western Europe, and used as a sort of way to show to society that there is something that holds a society together. And indeed, we can see examples of these in various countries, such as the obligatory crucifix in Italian public school classrooms, of which the Italian government said that this originally Christian symbol was also meant to remind us of generally held, generally shared values in the country. We can also see established church systems, church-state systems, as a sort of reservoir of religious belonging. And perhaps even we could say that there is some deep memory in some Western European countries of the Westphalia system, where our national states were not first secular states, but confessional states to start with. So there is this connection between religion and national identity, and it comes not so much from religious groups, or not at all. It's even contested sometimes by religious groups or religious leaders, but it comes from the political leaders. And how can we explain these developments? Well, of course, it is very easy to explain these developments by just pointing at the introduction of Islam into our countries, or pointing at increased pluralism in our countries. But I personally think there is more to that. I think there's a conglomerate of reasons, of developments, why the state is suddenly so much interested in values. And these developments lie in the domain of the state and of the society themselves. Let's first look at the reasons in the domain of the state. We see over the last few decades that our states have lost some of the hardcore activities that they used to carry out. For instance, the energy supply, the railway station, the telecom, all those services that were really carried out by the state are over the last decades privatized and also liberalized. We see issues like monetary policy, international trade, and even large part of immigration and asylum policy are no longer in the hands of the national state, but in the hands of the European Union. So a certain loss of hardcore state activities. We also see a retreat of the classic welfare state. And instead of looking after the citizen from the cradle to the grave, we see now that the catchword is self-reliance of the individual. So the individual has to provide for him or herself. And of course, it is partly done by budgetary necessity. And we see that through all these developments, also the face of the state has changed. So it's no longer the postman or the police officer or the train driver that are our everyday faces of the state that we personally encounter every day, but they are business people. The functions are carried out, but they are private companies. And at the same time, when you want to encounter the state, you do so through sometimes anonymous telephone call centers or internet web forms. So I think a lot of these traditional functions of the state have changed. And how does the state manifest itself at the moment very much? I think the state is very much into behavior change of our citizens. For instance, to be more conscious about the climate, or perhaps to stop smoking. The state is involved in those sorts of things, try to make our behavior change. The state is also heavily involved in issues like preventive health policies, like preventing obesitas, like preventing people taking too much alcohol or drugs. And of course, those concerns are also partly because of budgetary consequences for the state if we would behave otherwise, but still the state is very much into those behavioral things. And we see that the state is currently heavily involved in tough medical ethical issues concerning the beginning and the end of life, really high moral issues. And the state is very much involved in cultural issues, like integration, like what is the range of freedom of expression, or what do we need to understand by non-discrimination. And of course, the state is legitimized to do so from a public order point of view, but still, in the eyes of citizens, it is really the soft sector in which the state is manifesting itself. There is also another reason for the turn towards this interest in values, and it lies in the sphere of the citizen and citizenship. Not everywhere we see that there's a strongly developed sense of national citizenship, because in many areas we see that there are strong regional identities, or that there are or were strong policies of decentralization. We also see that the familiar social welfare states are being transformed, which gives the whole idea of citizenship, insofar as it is present, a different flavor. We see a rapid change of our familiar surroundings. So the question, what does it actually mean to be a citizen? Or integration of immigrants, where the question is, into what should immigrants integrate? And of course, issues like globalization and the problematic sides of religion that we see in some instances in the world. So I think also from the side of the citizens, these diverse trends and factors make us more aware of issues of values and identity. And I think there's a third reason, and that reason lies more in the domain of the society, although all these different domains overlap to a certain extent. We see that in many countries, and at least in my country, we turned from an extremely permissive society into a society where there's much more attention to law enforcement. There are reports being produced that explain why citizens get very irritated by behavior of other citizens, their fellow citizens, and that there is a wish in the country for more civility. It may sound strange to you, but these things are under discussion at the moment. And of course, and that is what I started with, there is the issue of religious pluralism and the multicultural society. So we see this connection, and we see that there are a number of different reasons for that. Not isolated reasons, but a conglomerate of reasons. And what is the reaction to these? Well, of course, there are many critical reactions to these developments. Some of the critical reactions say, well, there is no such thing as a Christian culture or Christian values or a Judeo-Christian values. And they say sometimes the role of Christian churches towards these modern developments was ambiguous and sometimes hostile. So how can we see that our modernity is based on Christian values? Think of the whole idea of democracy, of human rights. And similarly, when you look at current issues of medical ethical nature, they say, well, don't we see that the majority of the people want a more progressive stand, and we see that religious communities have a more conservative stand to that. And another voice of criticism is that they say public officials and politician parties that use such reference are not Christians themselves, and they just use it to instrumentalize religion. So these references, the connections between religion and national identity are in a way rejected. But, and this is the question I want to raise, should we not take it a little bit more seriously? Should we not see these attempts by politicians as a sort of intuitive attempt to tap into sort of deeper layers of Western culture? And layers that do have a particular connection with Christianity and that do provide a certain orientation for public values, but are also not exclusive and that are also open to change. I just want to put this question before you. What should we think about? Well, I would think if we look at those deeper layers, the whole idea of how we understand in the West the notion of individuality, which was in part developed in relation to Christian thought, as is, for instance, developed by the thinker Siedentop. Or perhaps the notion of equality that was shaped in a particular way in our Christian and Western societies that helped pave the way for the rule of law, such as our colleague Silvio Ferrari pointed out. Or a sort of morality that is, of course, dynamic and sometimes in conflict with churches and moral view of religious believers, but still was brought in a Christian context. And I think that such a way of talking about the deeper layers of Christianity in Western culture is not meaningless, and I think it is also not threatening to religious minorities. I hope that our moderator gives me a few more minutes because of the delay that we had in the beginning. So I would like, and that's my final section of my presentation, to see what does this mean to religious freedom. Well, I would say there's two paradoxes. We all know that if somebody claims religious freedom as a single individual, he or she will hardly have any, it will hardly be recognized because religion is always embedded in more community practice. So if there are a number of people that have the same type of religious concerns, usually it is accommodated on the basis of religious freedom. But what we do see that if there are even more and more people that claim a certain position on the basis of religious freedom, that in some cases those claims are rejected again. And that is what we see at the moment. For instance, I think a good example is the Swiss regulation of obligatory mixed school swimming in elementary school. For the secondary schools, the Swiss regulation provided exemption for girls for religious reasons, but not for elementary schools. And in the beginning, parents who claimed such an exception for their daughters was granted that exception, but only when more and more parents wanted to opt for that exception, it was no longer given because of concerns of integration. And a second paradox that I think we see is that in our society sometimes exceptions or claims to religious freedom that were traditionally always awarded for Christian Orthodox groups, Orthodox Christian groups, are now under pressure because of a fear that when those same exceptions are granted to Islam, that our dominant values in society will change for the worse. And we have to think especially in terms of male and female relationships. In Orthodox Christianity, they have a specific idea of male and female relationships, and it is usually accepted in the Netherlands. But when those same privileges were granted to Islamic believers, I think a lot of people would be a little bit afraid of that. So I will close. What does this mean? I think that these impact, I think we should seriously think about this connection between national identity and religion. I think it has some impact on religious freedom, not always for the better, but I think we really should think that through. And I think two of the legal challenges is that we have to rethink what equality means, equal treatment means in relation to religion, and what the cultural dimension of religious liberty is. And these questions are part of a larger challenge, and that is to redefine the relationship between the secular and the religious on the one hand, and also to define the relationship between the secular and the traditional Christianity on the one hand vis-à-vis Islam. It is a challenge, but I think that challenge is worthwhile taking up. Thank you.
Good to go? Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say, like everybody else, what a great honor and pleasure it is to be here. It's my very first visit. I'm much enjoying it. I look forward to working with you in the next 20 minutes. My presentation, mine's not going to move either. I'm sorry. Here we go. Only I've now done it too hard and I've gone too far. No, here we are. I'm good. My presentation is in two parts. I want to talk to you first about a project in which I've been involved. This is called the International Panel on Social Progress, and I'm picking up the thread of pluralism within that in a global context. In the second part of what I'm going to say, I'm going to pull out the European case, a little bit like Sophie, to show you how pluralism works, or how the religious situation is developing in a part of the world which is both increasingly secular and increasingly diverse. And my examples are going to be Britain and France. So let's start with the global perspective. The project that I'm going to talk about is called the International Panel on Social Progress, and I'm going to have to skip quite fast through the background. I was asked to be part of this. I still remember the day when I got the email, which came to me as a challenge. Was I up for this? Don't these guys know I'm retired? But I was asked within this big panel, which works like the Intercontinental Panel on Climate Change, same kind of process, that you gather and bring together the information that you can to offer it to experts. So social scientists of all kinds were called to present their data, their findings, and to interpret them to a non-specialist audience. It had three sections: the first economic, the second political, the third cultural, and I was asked to head up the chapter on religion in this context. It was a big task. I found it extremely interesting for a number of reasons. It was the first time in a long time that I had, as it were, hung out with the mainstream. Normally, I work with people who are interested in sociology of religion, in religious issues, and we are pretty committed to a better understanding of the subject. That is not so much the case in the mainstreams of social science. That was my first learning curve, because either the assumed correlation between modernization and secularization still holds, or religion is deemed back, in inverted commas, and toxic. So it's either not there, or it is damaging, and it follows has little to do with social progress. I and my team were not going to take that, and so we had to find a way through this kind of resistance to what we were doing. Like a number of people that have spoken already from this podium, we noted that 80+% of the world's population affirms some kind of religious identification, a proportion, of course, that is growing rather than declining. The peak of secularity or secularism is in the 1970s. The change comes because of significant changes in the former Soviet Union and in China, plus differential birth rates, which is one of the striking things that the demographers now tell us, that people who have religious commitment have more children. So the secular sectors are, as it were, self-limiting because they don't reproduce. We make an emphasis on lived religion, which is rather different from the legal perspective. We are concerned with the everyday lives of people rather than the coding or framing of these issues. Am I doing it wrong? I think I'll just go on, don't worry. What we do in chapter 16, which is one chapter of 22, is to emphasize the significance of belief and practice in the everyday lives and local contexts which we analyze, looking for the impact of religion and its relevance to social progress in a wide variety of fields. Family, gender, and sexuality, where there are a lot of frictions between seriously held religion and some changes in or even traditions in family life. The diversity and democracy strand, which is the one I'm going to pull out because you've asked me to talk about diversity and pluralism. We look at conflict and peacemaking. We look at everyday well-being and development, welfare issues, and we look at care for the earth and the whole debate about climate change. Further, and this is the core of our argument, we argue that researchers and policymakers pursuing social progress will benefit from careful attention to the power of religious ideas to motivate, of religious practices to shape ways of life, of religious communities to mobilize and extend the reach of social change, and of religious leaders and symbols to legitimate calls to action. Now, I heard a great deal of the examples of that in the panel this morning, so I think these come together extremely well. But it's both the motivation that comes from doctrine and what religions teach, the practice of religion, and the networks associated with religious communities, and that you can legitimize certain calls to action. A very good example is the ending of the Ebola epidemic, which required change in burial practice, and only religious leaders could legitimate that. It's a very good example. But of all the above that we see here, we have to remember that they can be, these strong and powerful influences can be put to good or to ill. Religion is not necessarily benign or malign. But we have to look at context, at example, to see what is likely to happen. And social progress comes from the careful analysis of context and of selecting carefully where partnerships are going to be valuable and where they're best avoided. So we conclude this is the end of a 30,000 page report, so we've gone pretty fast, but our conclusions are that religion is persistent in the 21st century. That word persistent was carefully chosen. Religion is neither disappearing nor is it resurgent. It has always been there, but Western social science has chosen not to see it. So the change is as much as in perception as it is in reality, though I do think religion is taking new and noticeable forms. So that's a both and. Paramount is the importance of context in discerning outcomes, and that, of course, is quintessentially a social scientific task, to look at context, to not simply take, as it were, blueprints or givens, but simply to see how it works out on the ground. Again, I'm repeating what I've heard 2 or 3 times already since I arrived in this conference, the need for cultural competence relative to religion, religious literacy, but this is broader than literacy. It's cultural competence, and it is lacking. I've heard that before. That religion can initiate change as well as respond. It can be a powerful actor of initiating betterment, and it's very strange how the word betterment is entirely good and welcomed. The word prosperity is thought of pejoratively, but I've never been able to work out when betterment turns into prosperity. And our point really is the benefits, and here is another very carefully chosen word, well-judged partnerships. That you don't just grab anybody and work with them. You need to know each other, you need to understand each other. But one of our findings was very much that you can do a lot together, even if ultimately your aims are different and your teaching is different. I mean, the reproductive health in the Catholic Church is a good example. People into reproductive health have often held back from partnership with the Catholic Church, but they can do an awful lot together, even if right at the end they may decide that the Catholic Church cannot participate in this particular bit, or vice versa. So, a continuing need for critical but appreciative assessment and the demonstrable benefits of creative partnerships. Now, just a word about religious diversity as one strand within the big picture. I would ask you to consider this carefully as you move forwards, that diversity is a descriptive term and pluralism is a normative term. Diversity is an empirical question, a state of affairs. It is or it's not. It exists or it doesn't. Pluralism is much more about values and value judgments. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Who thinks it's a good thing? It can be looked at in terms of state policy. It can be looked at in terms of individual attitude. But if you begin to pull apart diversity from pluralism, you'll find the debate becomes easier. The problem, of course, is the literature does not do this. And the next few slides, which I think I'm going to go over quite quickly because of the time, I'm watching the time, but it is not correct to simply assume that the modern world is necessarily more plural, more diverse. Again, we have to pay attention to detail. I have slides where there is growing diversity. West Europe is a good example where we're going to do the detail. Latin America is becoming more diverse, but in a very different way. You don't see the in-migration of religions other than Christian, at least not in a great extent, but you do see growing diversity within Christianity. If you looked at Southeast Asia, and Singapore, one of the most diverse places in the world, that's nothing new. It's been there a long time, as has diversity in the US. But of course, they're very different. One is multi-faith, and one is, in the US, it is still very heavily Christian, but hugely diverse in terms of its range of congregations and denominations. Mindful, of course, that the building block of religion in the US is the congregation that builds into denominations, whereas the building block in Europe is the territorial parish that builds into the historic state churches. And then you find declining diversity in parts of the modern world for different reasons. Sadly, in the Middle East, as persecution drives out minorities, that's happening before our eyes, and it's not something that most of us welcome. And in parts of Africa, though you need to look very careful at the detail, you find it decreasing diversity to the extent of more people becoming part of the Christian or Muslim communities as opposed to indigenous religions. Now, I'm going to go quickly over a set of graphics. I'm sure these will be available to you at a later stage. Only it doesn't want to go quickly at all. And I'm picking up the story here. The next point I want you to grasp before we turn to Europe in detail is there's a huge spectrum on a global scale. This is my colleague, my mentor, David Martin, in the UK, who points out this big contrast on a global scale between transnational voluntarism at one end of the scale, Pentecostalism and how it can move and migrate across societies is a very good example of that. And right at the other end of the scale, there are the forms of religion based on a closed market, which regard certain territories as their sacred preserve. There is an isomorphic relationship between kin, ethnicity, and faith. And the point I want to make is not to say either is good or bad, that they both exist, but the words conversion or choice have entirely different meanings in the two situations. You should not make comparisons. This is classic apples and pears. And so the global variations run along a scale from North America, where the exercise of choice is normal, to Western Europe and Australasia, where it is accepted but less frequent, to the Arabian Peninsula, which is by definition Islamic territory where even foreigners cannot establish their own sacred buildings, though women can now drive cars. You see the scope, see the scale. When you're using words, they're changing in meaning. A conversion in America is one thing. A conversion in the kind of society described at the other end of the scale is quite different. Okay, so we come to the West European case, where the persistent paradox, the process of secularization continues, and yet there is a growing prominence of religion in public discussion. We've already noticed that, driven by the increase in religious diversity. The reason, it's a combination, it's a paradox, two things happening at once. At precisely the moment when they're most needed, European people are losing the vocabulary, tools, concepts that they require in order to have a constructive conversation about faith. Quite literally, we do not know what we are talking about. In short, a growing preoccupation with religious diversity exposes our inability to talk well about religion in public life. I see on a daily basis an ill-informed and ill-mannered debate about issues of extreme importance to the democratic future of European societies. This does not please me. But each society deals with this in a different way. We draw on our own resources to confront these issues. And here I end with the brief comparison between France and Britain. Another paradox. France is without doubt a more democratic society than Britain, both constitutionally and institutionally. There is no monarchy. Their upper house is elected, ours is not. There is no state church. Britain, however, is, though I fear we're losing it, hence the was, Britain, however, is a more tolerant society than France. So what is the relationship between democracy and tolerance? Of course, a majoritarian democracy like France is very different from a constitutional democracy like Britain. French minorities do not have a good time. Again, I'm not going to be able to develop the nice example I had, which I experienced 2 weeks ago, which was Emmanuel Macron talking to the French Protestant community as they celebrated 500 years since the Reformation. Ask me the right question and I'll tell you the story. In Britain, I find contradictory evidence. Again, I think I'm going to leave that to you can ask me to expand that if you like, but I do see evidence of national identity, very much like Sophie said, relinking with a kind of sense of being Church of England. And you can find this in the data pertaining to the Brexit debate, that people of faith, and particularly Anglicans, tended to vote leave. Whether you think that's a good idea or not is another question. But I'm going to conclude in this way, because the temptation to ask, is France or is Britain better, is almost irresistible. And I'm British, and I have to work hard at this. But what I've now concluded is that it's not one is better than the other, but each can do their model well, and each can do their model less well. The French have a predilection for principles. Talk to my French colleagues, they will always nail a principle to make their argument. Principles are fair to all parties, but they're rigid if they're taken too far. The British don't look for principles, they look for solutions. This is pragmatism. It relates again partly to our Anglicanism. It's a way of thinking. Pragmatism is inherently more flexible, but it's also more open to the abuses of power. Principles are fairer, but rigid. Pragmatism is flexible, but open to abuse. So it's not the question of which is better and which is worse. It's that each of us mine our traditions, mine our history, to produce out of them the optimal situation, optimal solution in our own context. We do not borrow other people's. So my conclusion is managing diversity is not a case of one size fits all. This is a more general finding of our work right through the International Panel for Social Progress. Again, context was paramount. I made that point. Take, for example, the relationship between religion and violence, which was brought to our attention many times by our mainstream colleagues. The key question is not, does religion cause violence, but under what circumstances is it likely that religion will become entangled in violence? I maintain that social scientists are well placed to provide answers to precisely these questions. And this is what we have tried to do in our chapter, and this is what I offer you in terms of a session on diversity and its management forms of pluralism. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon. Let me see how I can set this up. I don't have a PowerPoint. This is not intended to be seen as a virtue or anything of the sort. Political theorists among political scientists are somewhat allergic to PowerPoints. We tend to work with chalk, although this time I'll simply work with words and try to convey through appropriate pauses the lists of things that I'm going to be talking about. My presentation is a bit of a mix of two things. In almost every conference, almost every formal presentation that I give, I try to advance my research a bit. But it's impossible to advance that research without going over some of what I've done in the past. So I'm taking advantage of all of you to throw out one corollary of the theory of pluralism that I've developed elsewhere, and see if it sticks, see if it's intelligible, first of all, and see if it's acceptable to a broad audience as a way of thinking about pluralism. So my concern at the moment in my own research is to figure out what pluralism is. That is, what kind of paradigm it is, what problem is it supposed to solve? Now, in my published work, I had started thinking about pluralism in the context of associational rights or associational autonomy, the claims that some, and I stress the some, not all, but some non-state associations argue that they have over their members. Some non-state associations claim that they have a measure of what used to be called sovereignty, what I have called, following some other theorists, meta-jurisdictional authority, that is, authority over a certain jurisdiction, and also authority over the boundaries of that jurisdiction. And the way that I had expressed the problem of pluralism was in this way. I said many associations in liberal democracies claim to possess and attempt to exercise a measure of legitimate authority over their members. And they assert that this authority does not derive from the magnanimity of a liberal and tolerant state, but is grounded rather on the common practices and aspirations of those individuals who take part in a common endeavor. So pluralism, first of all, in the specific area of associations, was a claim about the world. It was a fact about the world. There is more than one claimant to sovereignty or meta-jurisdictional authority. Now, it's possible that many of those claimants to sovereignty are making false claims. But the important thing was that, from their perspective, the claims that some other association, for example, the state, was making, were not necessarily superior. You have this equality or this tension, this plurality of claims about the state. And I argued then that all pluralist theories, not only about associations, but pluralist theories about many other things, claim, first of all, that there are multiple instances of a certain phenomenon. The basic claim they make is there's more than one thing. Pluralism is more than one thing. But the problem is that pluralism is also more than one thing because there are many phenomena in the world that are plural. Different pluralist theories concern themselves with different phenomena. I'll be talking mostly about normative pluralist accounts, pluralism of value or of forms of life, the fact that there are many ultimate goods in the world and there are many ways of living one's life such that you pursue these goods. But not all of these forms of life can be fulfilled. The classic example is that you cannot be the best possible lawyer and the best possible violin player because some of the time that you will spend studying law, you will not be spending studying the violin. There's also a normative pluralist account of political sovereignty, which I described to you. Many entities claim ultimate political authority. Not all these claims can be valid because they are incompatible. If the state claims that it is superior to all the others, and the church, for instance, claims that it is superior in some aspects, or at least not inferior to the state, then not all these claims can be valid. And there's also pluralism about legal systems, where you can have multiple legal orders that in some cases will conflict, and no legal order is necessarily superior, even if it has norms within that order to understand and encompass and interpret the other. But there's also empirical descriptions of plural phenomena, and there's a strange relationship between the normative and the empirical descriptions of plural phenomena. Obviously, in cases of law and religion, there is a pluralism of claims to religious truth. There are many religions. We don't know which is valid. How does the state deal with this plurality, especially a state that is accustomed in Western history, at least, to assuming that one religion is true, or at least that it will be held to be true within a territory? And also there's the claim that there are many religions and not all can be valid, so how does each religion deal with this plurality? There's pluralism of cultural experience. And finally, and I think this is also relevant to law and religion studies, the pluralism that social scientists like Robert Dahl and more recently legal theorists like Carol Weisbrod have argued, that there is a pluralism of interest groups, where in this case religious organizations act not in the pursuit of autonomy, but in the pursuit of the provision and perhaps in some cases of rent-seeking, of obtention, provision and obtention of goods from the state. So I'll be concentrating on the normative accounts, but might discuss some of the impact of the empirical accounts later. Now, what I've argued, as I said, is that pluralism is more than one thing. There are many kinds of pluralism. But I've also argued that pluralism always follows a similar structure. The arguments that pluralists make are similar, no matter what phenomenon they're talking about. Usually, pluralists claim that these plural phenomena that we're talking about, let's just take political authority or sovereignty, are foundationally plural. They're deeply plural. They emerge independently. So the source of legitimacy of the state, at least the source of legitimacy of the liberal democratic state, is a completely different source from the source of legitimacy that, say, university professors see in their faculty endeavors, or the claims that religious institutions make. It's possible that religious institutions claim that the source of the state is the same, namely the will of God or the providential plan, but the liberal democratic state does not agree. So you have foundational plurality in the claims that each one makes. Second, you have something that some philosophers have called incommensurability. You have a problem of not being able to measure all of these claims on the same scale. So you can't say, for instance, there is one that is always superior to the other. Sometimes you will have no answer as to which one is superior. And this, I argue, leads to tragic conflict. It leads to situations where no matter what choice you make, something will be irrevocably lost. If you choose the state's claim to authority in a certain case, some religious group will feel that the exercise of authority by the state is completely unjustified. If you accept the ecclesiastical claim, the religious claim, the state will feel that it has simply had to abdicate its authority over a certain sphere. There is loss, there is tragic conflict. Now, I think that when we structure our arguments, when we structure our thinking in terms of pluralism, we can see how the question of the truth of these claims is one thing, and the question of the structure that they take and the implications for the way that we talk, especially about religion, is a different thing. I think that when we think of pluralist claims in terms of claims of foundational plurality, of incommensurability, and of tragic conflict, we're driven towards the conclusion that the categories with which we usually think of religious liberty are incomplete. Religious liberty, in almost all the philosophical literature, is understood in terms of the individual conscience. There's been a move away from, say, the medieval notion of spheres of authority, the doctrine of two swords or two powers, to the idea that the individual conscience is what is actually protected through freedom of religion. And even claims about institutional rights of religious groups, collective rights of religious groups, are explained in terms of the individual conscience which believes in the authority of these groups, but it's ultimately the interest of the individual in the group rather than the authority claim that is central. And I think that from a historical perspective, this is not a false claim. It's not a false methodological position. It is a great historical and moral achievement that we have come to understand the individual conscience as something worth protecting. But just because we have reached a historical achievement, we have gained this insight into the human spirit, doesn't mean that thinking in terms of tragedy, this achievement has not also displaced or caused us to forget about some other important aspects of religious freedom. So when we look at the study of law and religion, we see that from a perspective of method, authors like Michael Perry or Timothy Macklem focus on religious freedom as protection of the individual conscience, and other authors go further and say this protection of the individual conscience is a good thing to the exclusion of authority, because the exercise of individual conscience is an exercise of rational freedom, and the submission to authority is the bad kind of religion that we do not want to foster and protect. I think pluralism offers a methodological alternative that doesn't necessarily take a side on whether the individual conscience is good or bad. What it does say is that as manifested in historical, philosophical, political, and legal thought, the choice to focus exclusively on the individual conscience is not a neutral choice. It is a choice that distorts the phenomenon of religion and makes us not only misunderstand, but also transform religion into what we want it to be, rather than protect religion as it actually exists in the world. So pluralism gives us a way of focusing on certain aspects, namely authority, not to the exclusion of conscience, but in addition to conscience. Sometimes we approach a problem from one perspective, and that doesn't exclude another perspective. So I'll give you an example from value pluralism, and perhaps if I have time, I'll give you an example from political pluralism of how this could work. So if the main thesis of value pluralism, the idea that there are multiple goods, a multiplicity of incommensurably ultimate goods, not all of which are capable of realization, we have to choose what kind of life we will live in this world of incommensurable goods. So the interesting question is really, how should incommensurable goods be ordered? And this comes ultimately to a question of authority, namely, who decides how incommensurable goods will be ordered? This was, ironically, Thomas Hobbes's problem. Hobbes, who is the ultimate non-pluralist, thinks that there ought to be a single authority to decide how incommensurable goods will be ordered, because he is at his heart a value pluralist. He says there is no summum bonum. We don't know from reason alone what is the best thing to pursue. So if we think that questions about what form of life we ought to pursue are ultimately questions of authority, questions of who gets to decide, we can move from that to an account of authority as a defining feature of religious reason. Religious reasons, then, are mediated reasons. A religious reason, when a religious reason is offered, it is has a different structure from the way that, say, a reason of conscience alone is offered. When a philosopher, the ideal philosophers in fact do follow authority all the time, but when the ideal philosopher thinks about a moral question, the philosopher goes through a series of reasons for and against doing something or advocating a certain norm. And when they arrive at the solution, when they reach the conclusion that they have reached the correct solution to this moral problem, that reason that they have reached, that reason that they have concluded, binds their conscience directly. The proposition, X is right, binds the conscience directly in an unmediated way. It could be that someone whom I respect very much says that X is right. It could be that someone whom I respect very much says that X is wrong. But that is an independent factor from whether I think it is right or wrong. In cases of religious reasons, I believe, I evaluate the evidence, first of all, for accepting an authority. The authority of God, the authority of a spiritual system, the authority of a representative of God, etc. And the first thing that I conclude is whether the authority's claim upon me is true. Whether the authority's claim upon me is justified. And then I decide whether to act in accordance with the directives of that authority. Now, that does not exclude the exercise of conscience directly, because there is conflict in faith. There are moments in which I think that religious authority tells me to do one thing, and this is not something I feel completely at ease with. Perhaps because my appetites push me in a different direction, perhaps because the force of culture is pushing me in a different direction. So I may feel uneasy with specific authoritative directives, and if I feel too uneasy with these because I am conflicted, I have conflicted claims of conscience and claims of religious reason, it may cause me to eventually abandon my conviction that the authority has a claim upon me, and I will leave this, I will simply abandon the religious tradition or move away from the faith. But I think it's important to understand the structure of authoritative reasons, because it affects the way in which, especially the secular liberal democratic state, engages in conversation with religious persons. The secular liberal democratic state engages in conversation with religious persons by presuming that the reasons that they give are reasons that could be abandoned if the weight of evidence in a particular case is overwhelming, when in fact, the fact that a directive, and a principle, a command issues from an authority that the religious believer believes that they have a duty to obey is an integral part of the religious reason, and not something additional, not something ad hoc. Second, I think religious reasons can be revised, they can be criticized, they can be disentangled, but always with attention to the mediating role that authority plays. So the protection of religious freedom has to be directed at the protection of authoritative structures, and not only at the protection of propositional beliefs. It is not only the fact that a Roman Catholic believes that the host becomes the body of Christ that must be protected. It is the fact that the magisterium teaches that a Roman Catholic ought to believe that the host becomes the body of Christ. Simply believing one thing independently of the authority is in fact a misunderstanding of religious belief. Third, I think that there is no privileged vantage point from which to assess the correctness of religious reasons. Obviously, religious believers accept the correctness of their reasons, but there's no privileged vantage point from the perspective of the state. In part, what this means is that in some cases, there is no way of independently assessing the truth of a religious claim, independent of the authority that issues that claim. Some things are true because an authority makes a decision, expresses a judgment, interprets a claim, receives a certain prophetic vision, understands a command in light of other evidence. Very often discussions between the secular liberal democratic state and religious authorities ask, for instance, well, as a social practice, 90% of Roman Catholic women who are sexually active use contraception. So have not they exercised their judgment in certain ways, and this is in fact the Catholic view? Well, the sociological fact, the propositional fact, the health dimensions of a particular practice are not the issue here, and cannot be assessed independently of the authoritative directive of the religious authority. So the protection of religious freedom must include the protection of an appeal to religious authority. It must include the idea that when I seek protection for my religious freedom, I am not only seeking protection for a certain set of beliefs, I am seeking the freedom to submit to a religious authority that I believe has legitimacy over me. And fourth, insofar as some religious reasons pass through religious authorities, temporal religious authorities, in religious institutions, the protection of religious freedom must include the protection of those authoritative institutions. Otherwise, the state is protecting what it wants religion to be rather than what religion is. I think this is especially relevant, and I'll simply list a few areas where I think this is important. It's especially relevant in countries where religious parties religious organizations are social service providers, because there is no objective, final Archimedean point from which we can say the sphere of health and the sphere of religion meet in this specific line. You have multiple authorities that overlap, neither one of which is entirely legitimate from the perspective of the other. You have an overlap of authorities over the boundaries of a certain sphere. So when we make the claim of protection of religious freedom, we have to understand that there is no objective, unmediated answer to some of these questions. That these questions are in fact constituted by appeals to authority, that these appeals to authority are ultimately the essence of religious expression, and that in some cases we may simply need to accommodate them in order for the state to retain its legitimacy towards individuals not only as citizens, but also as members of religious organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint either. So there was some observable gender differences there. Maybe I don't know what the explanation is, but we're probably not even allowed to make that remark. By way of just sort of preliminary introduction, my day job, I work in the European Parliament, and I coordinate religious dialogue with religion in the European Parliament on the administrative level. And for that, I'm humbled by the presentation of my three fellow panelists who are very much experts in the field. I'm a practitioner. And I was also struck by the thought, when I was looking at the program, how the other three panelists also have the advantage that each of their names is a theological concept. So we have Sophia, wisdom, grace, and victory. And so that's another coincidence probably, but anyway. So just to move on to the topic, religion and pluralism in a changing world. I'll say a little bit about religion, a little bit about pluralism, and a little bit about the changing world. So essentially, my presentation is in 4 points and a couple of conclusions. First point, looking at pluralism in the world of the EU, what it means in an EU context. Then religion in the world of the EU, what religion means in an EU institutional context. Then the changing world of the EU, which is changing very rapid pace when you consider general political and institutional developments over a longer time. And then the changing world around the EU. And obviously the EU doesn't operate in a vacuum, so the changing world around the EU is important. So on the first point, EU pluralism, what does pluralism actually mean in an EU context? The EU has a motto, which is united in diversity. So from the very start, the EU is nailing its colours to the mast to say that we are an organisation that's about diversity. In fact, they didn't invent this phrase. Apparently the first reference to it is from Leibniz, but it was also used as a slogan in the campaign for Italian unification, and apparently also by the Canadian Federalists in a Quebecois context. So it is there. By the way, Indonesia also has as its state motto unity in diversity, which is something similar. And of course, here in the United States, you have a pluribus unum, which is not so far off either. In the EU, we have 28 member states, we have 24 official languages, and it's very much about respect for that kind of diversity. And I work in an institution where we actually have interpretation into 24 languages for the deliberations of the Parliament. So it's not consciously about religious diversity per se. And indeed, at the founding of the EU, the founding fathers were mostly devout Christians, people like Schumann and de Gasperi and so on like that, and there is that element that feeds into it. Religion in the world of the EU, we have a treaty-based system. The latest iteration of that is the Lisbon Treaty, which was previously called European Constitution, but that didn't go down too well, and was basically renamed as the Lisbon Treaty. And in that, we have a legal basis at, let's say, the highest level of law, fundamental law, obliging the EU to engage in dialogue with churches, religious organizations, and, we are Europe, non-confessional organizations. And that is essentially what I do, as I referred earlier, in my day job, animating that kind of dialogue from within the Parliament. The same treaty article says very clearly that the matter of church-state relations and the status of religions is what you would say in here, it's a states' rights question. It's on the federal system, it's a national competence, we say in the EU jargon. And so if China was described as one country, two systems, where religion is concerned, the EU is actually 28 countries, 31 systems. If you want to ask me about that afterwards, that I can elaborate on that. And also, within the EU context, each of the EU institutions, I work for the Parliament, Jan Fiegel, who spoke yesterday, was appointed by the President of the Commission as the executive, and we have the Council. My colleague Moreta worked previously for the Council, that's representing, let's say, the Member States. And each of those institutions, plus other services like now the External Action Service, implements that in its own way, in conformity with the particularities of that institution, and how legislators dialogue with churches, with religions, is not going to be the same way as how the executive dialogues with them, because they have different roles in the legislative process. Within the European Parliament, basically, the Parliament has adopted its own guidelines, therefore, on how it should be implemented. And that includes appointing one of its vice presidents, or you would say deputy speaker in the US context, in charge of, on a political level, and she's my boss, the lady who is in charge of overseeing that on a political level. Also, she would have to draft an annual report to the parliamentary authorities on what she has done in the field of religious dialogue in the year. Has to organise regular, open seminars and dialogue sessions with the representatives of the different partners, both religious and non-confessional. And the other thing is the dialogue should be linked to the parliamentary work. I mean, this is something that was specified. So it should be with, dealing with what they're dealing with on committee level or on parliamentary delegation level and so on. And not just, it's not interreligious dialogue. We don't do interreligious dialogue. It's dialogue about policy. And so typically we organize 2 or 3 of these kind of high-level seminars during the year with different representatives of the religions coming from different parts of the EU to talk about policies and to give input into the stuff that we are working on in the Parliament. That's us being proactive. We're also reactive in the sense that if we are approached by one or a group of the partners in the dialogue and say, we really want you to organize something, a seminar on a very specific issue, whether it be, I don't know, migration, which has been a hot topic recently, then we do that. And you just, sometimes you'll have incoming visits of, high-ranking faiths leaders who are coming to Brussels to dialogue with the institutions, and we have an open door to meet them and hear what their concerns are. Each of the major religions and also some non-confessional organizations would have a permanent office in Brussels, I mean, doing their representational work. Indeed, Francesco here, thanks to whom I was invited and participating in this wonderful conference, represents the Latter-day Saints Church in Brussels to the European institutions and would be typical of the kind of role that's there and the regular dialogue partner on my level, on the administrative level, to look at issues. Religious freedom. How am I for time? Am I okay? Yeah, you have a 2-minute time. You can probably waive that when I'm gone over. Yeah. Religious freedom, I won't go into too much detail. I mean, Jan Fiegel spoke a lot about that. It also featured in Mareta's presentation from the EU perspective. It's something that the EU is concerned about, but it's one of many, many issues. And sometimes people who aren't participating in that think that that's going to be the only concern that faith representatives have, religious freedom. We do care about it. In the Parliament, we have a cross-party, what we would call an intergroup, cross-party group that deals specifically with that and that even engaged with the External Action Service in drafting the guidelines, was consulted in a formal way on that, was promoting also the creation of the special envoy role. So we are engaged in that, but the Parliament is also engaged in other foreign policy areas that are of concern to faith representatives, and they engage with us on it. So I recently participated in a roundtable with representatives of the different churches, mostly at NGO kind of level, development NGOs or Caritas type organizations, about the EU-Africa Summit and the big investment plan that the EU is rolling out for Africa, and what the concerns of those faith organizations who are running projects and schools and health care facilities and so many other things on the ground, you know, having that input there was important. I'll move on to my third point, which is the changing world of the EU, and I won't stay too long on that because we do a lot of navel gazing in the European Union, examining and re-examining and rewriting our treaties and thinking we need to move competence, you know, from the federal down to the state level and up and whatever. So, but there is an evolution, and Eurosceptics would say the evolution has been all to the centre. And, you know, we've created a foreign action service or external action service. Maybe after Brexit it will be actually named a foreign service, let's see. We've given more powers to the European Parliament where I work. And the practical implication of that is that faith-based organizations that want to engage on certain issues, for example, climate change, for example, international trade, of course they can lobby or they can contact and try and discuss with their national government, but the decisions are being taken on a Brussels level, on an EU level, so they need to be at a minimum there as well, but probably investing even more of their energies on an EU level. Yeah, briefly, there's also an evolving policy agenda. That's the other internal thing that's changing constantly in the EU. I once did an exercise in another presentation where I took an encyclical of the Pope Benedict, Caritas and Veritate, dealing with a lot of social issues, and identified all the issues that were categorized into different chapters, and put up a list on the other side of all the standing committees of the European Parliament, and you could actually see all the parallels. He didn't write it for that purpose, but in other words, every single issue that was dealt with was being dealt with on a European level by one of the standing committees, and that's the level of engagement. I'm just citing the Catholic Church, but other churches and faith organizations would have, because the EU is involved in a lot of things. And that often can result in very interesting coalitions and alliances springing up. You had something called the Sunday Alliance spring up, which wanted to have Sunday, a day of rest, and making sure labour laws reflected that. And that brought together churches and trade union movements. You have issues like human trafficking, especially trafficking of women, surrogacy, that bring together churches and women's organizations that are often at odds on other issues, sexual reproductive health and things like that. The changing world, so jump to my fourth point, the changing world around the EU, what I've subtitled, Never Miss a Good Crisis, especially an existential one. And the EU has been through 2 or 3 existential crises over the past couple of years, starting with the economic crisis, which was existential in terms of its currency. There was a time when people thought, will the euro go under? Will it just, that whole project disappear? We had the migration issue, again, existential in the sense that our free movement of people agreement known as Schengen had to be suspended as a result of it, and people thought, can the whole project survive? And we've had a lot of terrorist incidents and attacks. Some people try to amalgamate that with the whole migration issue, which becomes a problem in itself, that type of approach. And we also have Brexit, which potentially could have been an existential crisis if it had started a particular train of events. I mention these because they're all issues, in fact, in which the religious actors are very much engaged and involved. I mean, I won't go into all of them, but just imagine, take the one like migration. Who do you think in the EU context is actually at the forefront of reception, humanitarian at the first phase, of the wave of migrants that we've had, and then in the follow-up, even in housing provision, in education, language training, and so on? You won't be surprised to hear that there's a lot of faith-based organizations involved in that work. So of course they have an interest, and even at a macro level in designing policy. I mean, Pope Francis over the summer holidays came out with a major policy document on how migration should be handled. I mean, worldwide, but obviously with very immediate implications for Europe. In that. Okay, where will I jump? I'll jump to my conclusions, actually. So basically, the EU, as I say, it's legally obliged to have this dialogue. So we'd have to be doing it anyway, just to fulfill the letter of the law, because we're in a system of laws and under the rule of law. But even without this legal obligation, we'd have to be doing it, we should be doing it, simply because of good governance, simply because we are always talking about better lawmaking and better policy making. And if you want to make good policy, then you need to be engaged in this way and listening to what organizations that, despite some of the statistics that religion is disappearing from Europe, and we saw in some of the other presentations those kind of issues, but still very much present on the ground, and therefore has to be brought in. Maybe I'll just finish with one very small little anecdote of a practical application of how we are involved in this kind of dialogue in the European Parliament. Last week, in the same week, I was assisting my boss, the Vice President, in receiving an inward visit of all of the religious leaders of Azerbaijan, together with the wonderfully named State Committee for Religious Organizations of Azerbaijan, a Soviet relic that still persists in Azerbaijan. And in the same week, we met with the British, the English and Welsh bishops there to talk about Brexit and to talk about how they felt the British government was not actually taking seriously the human aspects of Brexit, things like prisoner exchange schemes, things like development aid, development budgets, limitations on arms exports, and so on. And we also, in the same day, had a Rosh Hashanah celebration that we launched Jewish New Year in the Parliament. I mean, just to give a little flavour. So it's an ongoing, as I say, there's proactive, there's reactive, and there's very, very many activities taking place. I'm just talking about the Parliament. Mairead spoke about the External Action Service, Jan Fiegel about the Commission to some extent. So all of the EU institutions, despite sometimes a bit of bad press on the outside of being perceived as, you know, militantly secularist and laïcité à la française, there is that a little bit in the DNA, but we are much more than that. And we as EU institutions are very engaged on a day-to-day basis with all sorts of faith-based actors. Thank you very much.
We'd like to thank our panelists for their contributions, and I note as a moderator my gratitude. They've all been very, very punctual, which has allowed us some time now for questions and comments. We'll have you raise your hands, and as a microphone comes to you, let's go here first, and then we'll go here and there.
So my question is to Victor. Around this question of authority and sort of a loyalty to particular authorities, and I'm thinking in particular of the Canadian case right now, but this is across a number of different countries, United States as well, where certain religious communities feel obviously that they obviously have an authority to the authority of their faith, especially in the area of moral conviction, moral direction. But they also believe that they must be loyal citizens, and they have an authority, they respect the authority of the state. You can take the great parable of the denarius, where Christ says, you know, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and God that which is God's. But in certain countries now we see increasingly where the state is acting more and more in areas that relate to the moral law, and are passing positive law, passing legislation that for many people of faith is challenging in a very fundamental way their authority, their respect for the state's authority. Some communities historically, if we look from the time of the Reformation, have simply just checked out and have drawn away from participation in civic life. We can think of various Mennonite communities. As the state has encroached more and more into areas of the moral law, we can think of cases around the marriage debate, euthanasia, and so forth. There's increasing pressure, it seems, on various religious communities as to where that ultimate loyalty lies. Some religious communities now are openly talking about what sort of civil disobedience do we need to engage in to tell the state, because there's not being enough accommodation in many cases, what sort of civil disobedience do we need to engage in to allow us to continue to be active and present within the world and not to sort of secede from the world. What is the appropriate response, would you say, from a legal perspective around questions of accommodation for when you get to a point where communities of faith that feel a loyalty to the civil authority really feel that that has been so constrained that they need to engage in types of civil disobedience that would allow them to establish maybe new institutions, faith-based institutions, set up in parallel to the state, but not necessarily against the state? What's the appropriate response in a pluralist society?
Thank you. Let's take 4 questions before answering. There is a question right here. Would you raise your hand, please?
Merci. Je voudrais à mon tour
Thank you.
exprimer toute ma reconnaissance à tous les intervenants
To all
pour la clarté de leurs exposés.
of your
mais je-
presentation. And just a couple of questions I have and concerns I have. For example, Mr. Victor, you talked about
conscience religieuse.
You talked about the religious conscience and the conflict in faith. I tell myself that freedom of religion is a matter of human right.
Est-ce que
So, in that debate, can we, that you presented before us, can we say that the religion is at the source of human right that we are defending today? Since human right, since religious freedom is a human right, then I would like to ask Mr. Obra, who said that he would rather not pronounce himself on the question, and I'm very interested to know around the argument that was presented around the Brexit. In your opinion, since you presented to us your participation in regards to in relations to the works done in the European Union, how do you explain that Brexit matter? If you may give us your opinion on that. And also you talked about the religious leaders' participation in your works. And here and there you have Jewish contributing, and here and there the Pope. And I'd like to know if that discussion that you have with religious leaders at the European community, at the European Union, is based on the fundamental act that has created the Union, that has led to this communication with religious leaders, or it's because of your interior guidelines that you have come to having to interact with these religious leaders, or you have, and also if you have a critical mass of leaders to whom you turn when you have those specific works to deal with, that you turn to participate in these works, or do they on their own come to you? And to Sophie, as you talked about the changes in regards to the state's functions that occur at the beginning and at the end of life, would like to know the impact of that intervention by the state on the freedom of religion. And just one last concern: Great Britain was attacked by terrorists, and I would like to express my sympathy, and I would like to present my argument also. So the argument that was presented by those who perpetrated that attack, was it a religious argument that allowed them to justify that attack? And so Grace Davie. Okay?
Donc, ok, je vous remercie.
So, thank you.
Let's go to another question here, and we'll come back in a moment.
Mohammed Amin, my question is for anybody on the panel who wishes to take it.
Câu hỏi của tôi cho bất cứ bốn vị. Một người nói rằng, tất cả những người nói ra đều đồng ý rằng mỗi một cá nhân có quyền tự do để mà theo cái ý muốn của họ, mà không có thể lệ thuộc vào cái nhóm người nào. Và tất cả bốn người đều đồng ý rằng những người đó có quyền đi theo cái lương tâm của họ, và họ có quyền đi theo cái sự lãnh đạo của tôn giáo của họ nếu họ muốn. có cái người có cái tôn giáo nào mà có quyền tôi có thêm một câu hỏi khác nữa rồi sau đó chúng ta sẽ trả lời.
First of all, I would like to thank all of the panelists, but I would like to ask Professor Grace Davis. It's about thesis about the lessening of the diversification of religion. Don't you think that it's one side of the coin? Every coin has two sides. Today's man can choose different aspects of religion as a commodity. Alan Barker wrote about this. Hence, this conformist peculiarities of new religions show its diversification, so they grow and they can satisfy a man. Therefore, how can you comment this or your thesis about the lessening of this diversification of religion has a regional aspect?
All right, we'll give the panelists just a moment, make sure everyone understands. Pardon me, could you repeat the question? I think we only got part of the question. Are you listening, Grace? Are you able to?
I put it on one and I didn't get it.
Okay.
Should I be on one?
I believe on one. Yes. If you could repeat, please, the question.
How do you the lessening of this diversification, is it the only one? Is it has a regional, or it is going everywhere else? Is there a process of lessening of diversification of religious thought?
Just a moment. Make sure everyone's okay. Let's begin. Okay, let's begin answering. If we could, let's begin with Fergus on the far end.
Bon, la première question n'était pas pour moi, donc je vais commencer avec les questions de Madame. Vous êtes de Côte d'Ivoire, je pense.
First question of
voilà,
Ivory Coast
donc,
is so the question of practicing. If we had another hour of Brexit, I could talk to you about it for another hour. I could talk to you about the reasons, but I don't think we have a religious dimension in this. It's very complex, but isn't a religious dimension. There is one colleague of mine that is very Christian, and she was saying this is very good. We'll have Brexit because now Europe has lost its Christian values. And I said, you think that tomorrow after Brexit, abortion is going to be not allowed and homosexuality is not going to be allowed in the UK. It's not against the popular life that has given these society that we live in. So when we, in the religious dialogue in the European institutions, the base is decreed the legal status that imposes this obligation in all the institutions. And I'd explained that I wasn't maybe clear enough that each institution does in accordance to what they want to do. And so we have adopted a certain internal legal document in the way that we're going to implement this obligation, this legislative obligation. So how do we choose the partners? The partners that we choose volunteer, because the Catholic Church and all the churches, Christian churches, are present in Brussels with the representatives. And so if I need a specialist in migration, I will contact these organizations that are in Brussels. And sometimes it's a bishop, sometimes it's a non-governmental organization, ONG, NGO. And I think that's about it. That's about me.
Alors, je vais continuer à répondre à vous, continuer le thème linguistique avant de changer en anglais pour le reste.
To continue the linguistic theme here, I'll answer in French also.
D'un point de vue historique, la conception du droit humain vient...
the human rights, the idea of human rights finds its roots in religion, in my opinion. And in my opinion, the collective freedom in the church came before the freedom of individuals, and so the institution. So before the individual conscience, we had the freedom of the institutions, and so at its source, the religion is at the source. There are other sources for that, as a matter of fact, but if we have to address this, I think that the question of freedom of religion is not about where the boundaries of these rights are. There are possibly other human rights that may be in conflict with the freedom of religion. I think that this is, at this point, something that can be explored. But we cannot address the freedom of religion without checking if there is no conflict between one right or the other. But the freedom of religion is an important right, but it also leaves on the table the freedom of other individuals and other religions if we recognize certain human rights and not others. And that's always the conflict that we encounter. And when we have a conflict between right and authority,
I can in fact approach all the other questions that were posed together. I'll simply step back to the account of authority that I've given elsewhere. I've argued, and I follow. I generally follow in my book. I follow Joseph Ross's theory of authority. Ross is a famous legal philosopher who has proposed that the normal way of justifying authority is in terms of service. So that would address the problem of whether an authority, in part, it addresses the problem of whether an authority, a religious authority, may be imposed. And the way that Ross thinks authority works, and he's writing against the anarchist, he says, there are some reasons that may apply to me. Reasons, for example, to be just, to be loving, to live a life of purity, or to live, all sorts of reasons that ought to apply to my conduct. And in some cases, I can act on these reasons directly. I can think about them and act accordingly. But in many other cases, I'm more likely to act in accordance with those reasons, with those duties and obligations that impose upon me, if I submit to an authority than if I don't. And I think that, for example, this is the notion of service, understood as service, that the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church presents. And I think it's the notion of service that most religious authorities present, at least in most major religions, that the religious authority is there to help, effectively to help the believer to fulfill the reasons that God or some other belief system demands of them. Now, I think that the state, this is a theory of authority in general, so I think the state also claims authority on the basis of this service conception. As a citizen, I may have duties to other citizens. And as a citizen, it's more likely, perhaps, that I will be able to fulfill those duties. Take, for instance, taxation. I'm more likely to be able to help those in most need if I have an obligation to them by distributing some funds, some of my funds at least, through a tax system. And this I would call the first order authority of the state. But I'm also a member of all these other organizations. And I have reasons that apply to me as a member of these organizations. And I submit myself to these organizations, also on a first-order basis. But there are problems sometimes when organizations cannot make their instructions clear, or they cannot establish a sufficiently stable presence over time. So, for example, in order to have a place regularly to hold religious ceremonies, it's very convenient to have a property over a church. Or if you're going to exercise your duty of charity and your duty of healing the sick and housing the poor, it's important to be able to act within a certain sphere and do these things. And very often it's very important to do this clearly, to have a legal authority like the state that gives you the instruments and the institutions to do so, that recognizes property rights, that provides inspection of facilities, etc. But here's the problem. I may have then a reason to submit to the state because I'm a citizen, and another reason to submit to the state because it makes it more likely for me to obey the dictates of my religious organization or religious authority. And these two things may be in conflict. And this is what happens. This is why I think that the question of spheres is also important. Sometimes, to use your terminology, areas of moral law are also areas of public policy. And the problem is really at who gets to define whether this is an area of moral law or public policy. A Catholic hospital is a Catholic hospital. And there are non-Catholic hospitals and there are Catholic non-hospitals. So here you have an overlap of two distinct authorities. And it's not always clear which one ought to triumph. Now, my account is that the state ought to minimize, whenever possible, the tension between the claims of authority that an individual feels as a member of a religious group and the claims of authority that they feel they have as a citizen. Because otherwise they may, in fact, the state may lose the legitimacy it has on a second-order basis from the religious organization. And disobedience is warranted. And so I think that in general, accommodations and exemptions tend to favor this. There's another thing that it's possible for the state to avoid if it makes sufficient accommodation, or if it takes the claims of authority of religious organizations seriously. And it's that religious organizations may opt, if they cannot live their lives among themselves according to their principle, they may feel the only other opportunity they have to live their lives in accordance with their principles is to take over the state through explicitly Christian political platforms or explicitly Islamic political parties, etc. And this presents a problem for pluralism. And I think it's a problem that is best avoided by recognizing a multiplicity of authorities.
I have a series of rather different questions to think about. The question of the motivation for terrorist attacks in Britain. Is that on now? Is that better? Yes. The question of terrorist attacks on Britain and what their motivation was or was not, I think for the individuals in question, they probably thought it might be motivated by religion, but I'm not sure that that particular line of religious thinking was recognized by any mainstream religion that you or I might recognize. So I almost wonder whether the question's irrelevant in the sense that all attacks are motivated by some ideology or distortion of ideology, which might be a distortion of a religious ideology. The point was that it was unacceptable and destructive and has to be dealt with as such, because if it is religious or not, that's not going to excuse it in any way at all. The question about is it legitimate for any religious group to impose its authority, it's one that provokes considerable thought. I often used to say to my students when they were trying to understand what a religion was, that if you join a religion, you're not joining a debating society. You're joining a group that has a doctrinal base. Are you going to accept that or not? And yet, in a modern democracy, it's clearly unacceptable to impose any kind of doctrine by coercion. That's not acceptable in a democracy. But I also think we need to think of the institutions themselves, that some religions are much more capacious and can contain within themselves much more diversity of belief. Others are prone to schism and deal with diversity by splitting into different groups. And so I think it's as much an organizational question as it is a philosophical one. And the question about reduction in diversity becoming less in some parts of the world, is this because of global trend or regional difference? I think it's probably because of global trends but experienced regionally. And I hope that I made it clear, absolutely clear in my presentation, that context matters. That you can never see a global trend that's going to impact everybody in the same way. Your history, your development, the way you approach religious life, the way you approach all sorts of other things are going to make a huge difference in the way that trend impacts in your case. And in some cases, migration has led to increasing diversity. In other cases, because the migration is going in a different direction, it may have led to shrinking diversity. And we simply have to look at each case at a time, although the underlying differences may be global. And of course, one thing I didn't develop, which is very clear, is because of the capacities of modern media and the reach of modern media, that we experience diversity even if we never move at all. That we can no longer live in isolation from diverse currents all over the world, and we have to consider our own sets of beliefs in relation to others, even if we never meet them face to face. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question about the beginning and the end of life, the moral issues. They are very much in discussion in my country, especially about the end of life. I see it that, of course, values and views about these issues are changing, but it's first of all also a matter of new moral questions that are prompted by new medical possibilities and new medical techniques. So in a way there's a value change, but also in a way there's just new issues. My personal point of view is that it is wise not to legislate on these issues too soon, not to legislate on these issues overnight, because they are just often too complex for that. So wait with legislation. But sometimes that's not possible because there is a bill on the table and parliaments just have to decide about that. It's just a mechanism in which parliament works. When that happens, of course, I think it is important that there's room for conscientious objection for doctors or for nurses, but usually that is not the main issue. The main issue is that because these issues are so complex, that certain important arguments are not heard or some important elements are overlooked. And I think, therefore, that religious communities, although in the eyes of some they are seen as rather conservative on these issues, that they have a certain moral intuition to see what are important things that should be brought into the discussion. So that not particular things are just not taken into account. So yes, I think it is wise to wait, if possible, with legislation and try to forge a broad consensus in the society once you have an overview of what is really at stake. And I also think that sometimes these issues, when they're decided at the level of legislation, you get a sort of clash of radical opposing views on these points of view, and there is hardly a way to deal with it in a good way. And therefore, I think that sometimes perhaps it's important not to let ideologies just confront each other and get into sort of zero-sum game in the legislation, but perhaps people who think at the theoretical level quite different about these things, that they can come to a certain consensus when it comes to practical cases real cases in practice. That even persons who are radically in favor of something or radically opposed to something see that in a particular case it is good, or at least not bad, to deal with that individual person or individual case in a particular way. And I think that's also a way to take a little bit of the conflict issues out and gives us some time to, well, to think over these questions. But then you need a good system that, that you don't act against the existing law, but still have some opportunity, well, under the law, to see what might be a way forward. So I hope that's a good answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Would you join with me in thanking our panelists? We will now have a break and begin the next sessions at 4:15.